One more turn of the stair, and they would all see her. Not the girl in the borrowed gray, not the quiet hands that carried another woman's train, but the thing underneath, the blood. The world believed it had burned out of the earth a lifetime ago. Selene kept her eyes on the worn stone and counted her own breaths the way her mother had taught her, slow and even, giving nothing away. One more turn, she thought, and there would be nowhere left to hide what she was. The great hall of Vaskar had been cut into the living mountain, and Selene felt the weight of the stone overhead like a hand laid flat against the back of her neck. Torches burned in iron brackets along walls older than any kingdom whose name she knew. Between them stood the whole court of the Wolf King, rank upon rank, and every face had turned toward the doors to watch the bride of the treaty come in. They were not watching Selene. That was the entire design. Ahead of her walked Ravella, wrapped in white and silver, her chin lifted, her dark hair caught with river pearls. Ravella was her cousin, and Ravella was lovely, and Ravella had practiced this walk for a month, while Selene knelt behind her with pins held between her lips. To the 600 souls of Vaskar, the woman in white was a king's daughter, sent north to bind two peoples who had spent a generation tearing at one another's throats. The truth was quieter and far more dangerous, and only 3 living people carried it. The bride was a servant dressed as a princess. The servant 3 steps behind her, in borrowed gray, holding the train off the floor, was the last true daughter of a house the world had agreed to forget. Keep your gaze down, she told herself. Be no one at all. No one had ever been put to death for being no one. At the head of the hall, on a seat of black stone and old antler, sat the Alpha King. Solène had heard him spoken of the length of the journey north, and none of it had readied her. Severin of Vaskar was not young. There was iron in the dark of his hair and a long, pale scar that ran from his temple into his beard, and he sat with the stillness of a man who had learned stillness in worse places than a throne room. His eyes moved over the approaching bride without warmth and without cruelty, simply weighing. The way a soldier weighs a river he means to cross. These were shifter lords, wolves in the shapes of men, and Selene had been warned they could hear a racing heart across a room and smell a lie the way she could smell coming rain. She had spent the ride north, teaching her own heart to lie for her. The marshal spoke for the king. He stood at the foot of the dais, in gray and steel, a broad man with a pleasant voice, and named Ravella to the hall as the daughter of Halvanmore, come freely to seal the peace. Valdris, the court called him. He had ridden the whole length of Halvanmore's roads to fetch this bride, and it was Valdris who had chosen which cousin would wear the white. Solène did not yet understand why. A whole war rested on the lie holding, and the man who had built the lie had built it around her, and she did not know his reasons. And not knowing frightened her more than any raised voice could. Ravella sank into her practice curtsy. Selene sank lower, as a servant should, set the train down with care, folded her hands, and made herself small. It should have ended there. But a young lord near the dais, wine bright in his face, looked back at the girl in gray and laughed, and said loud enough for the near ranks to hear that Halvanmore must be a poor land indeed, to dress its princess in pearls and send her maid out in a dead woman's cloak. Laughter moved through the hall like wind over grass. Selene felt her face heat, kept her eyes on the stone, and gave them nothing, because giving them nothing was the one thing she had ever truly owned. Then a voice said, "Enough." It was not loud. It did not need to be. The hall fell quiet so fast that Selene heard the torches breathing. She did not look up. She knew the voice had come from the black stone seat. The maid held her lady's train without dropping it, which is more than half this court could manage sober. The Alpha King said, "I will not have my hall laughing at the low for the crime of being low." And then, when she had already begun to let her shoulders down, he spoke again, and this time she felt the words come toward her across the whole length of that terrible room. "Girl, in the gray, raise your eyes." For the space of one breath, Selene did not move, To raise her eyes to a king was not done by a servant, and every soul in the hall knew it, which was the trap of it. To refuse him was defiance. To obey was to put her face into the light before 600 strangers and a marshal who had chosen her cousin over her for reasons she still could not name. Her mother's voice came to her across years and miles. Whatever they take from you, keep your face still and your tongue quiet, and they can never take the rest. She raised her eyes. She looked at the Alpha King, and he looked at her, and for a moment, that stretched too long, something crossed his scarred face that she could not read. Not desire, not disgust. More like a man who hears a note of music he knows and cannot place. Solene held still under it, and told herself he saw only a tired servant, with a plain face and reddened hands, because that was all she had left him to see. "Your name," he said. "Soul, your grace." It was half of her own name, and so not quite a lie, and a thing that was not quite a lie was easier to keep straight in the dark. Then, Valdres stepped smoothly into the space between them, his pleasant voice smoothing the air, saying the bride was weary and the hour late, and the moment closed over like water over a dropped stone. The Alpha King let it close. But Solene felt his gaze follow her from the hall, and she did not think he had believed her. They gave Ravella the queen's apartments, high in the hold with windows of real glass and a fire kept through the night. They gave Solene a cot in the servants' under warren, and a place at her cousin's heel. That first night, the door shut and the two of them alone, Ravella let the soft voice slip. "He noticed you?" she said to the mirror, not turning. "You will make yourself less worth noticing, or you will make trouble for us both, and only one of us can afford trouble." She smiled at her reflection. "Poor soul. You could have had all this. You were only born to the wrong grandmother." Solene set the pearls in their box, one by one, and said nothing. "I was not born to the wrong grandmother," she thought. "I was born to the last one." She thought of the word that old woman had made her swear never to speak aloud, in a world that would put her to death for proving it still had a living throat to say it. And she kept her face still, and they took nothing more from her that night. In the deep hours old Nesta found her weeping without sound in the passage, and did not ask why, only pressed a warm heel of bread into her hand and said, "The hold was cruel to new girls and kinder to old ones." Solene would be an old one soon enough, she said, if she learned the two great rules. Keep out of the marshal's way, and never let the steward catch her idle. The steward caught her idle before the week was out. Corliss was a thin, sleepless man who ran the servants, the way a miser runs his coins, and he found Solene at dusk with empty hands and decided, with sour pleasure, that the new girl could take the duty every other servant found reasons to refuse. She would tend the lamps in the Hall of the Ancestors, the deep shrine where the Wolf Kings kept their dead, alone, each night, until he said otherwise. Solene carried her taper down into the dark under the mountain, pushed open a door of black wood banded in iron, and stepped into a long, low room of carved stone and old silence, and stopped. The first lamp stood cold in its bracket by the door, as all of them stood cold, waiting for her flame. But as she passed it, before her taper ever touched the wick, the lamp took light on its own, a small clear flame leaning toward her through the still air, as though something in the stone had waited a very long time to watch her walk in. Solene stood very still and watched the flame burn where no flame should be, and understood, with a cold deeper than the cold of the shrine, that the room knew her. She should have run. She had spent her life learning to run from exactly this, from any sign that the old blood in her was more than a story told in a shuttered room. But there was nowhere in Vasgar to run, and a cold lamp burning was proof of nothing a court could hang her for. So she did, the only thing she knew. She lit the rest herself, one honest flame at a time, so that if anyone asked she could say the shrine had been dark, and now was not, which was true, and safe, and quiet. The carvings ran the length of both walls, deep old letters cut by hands dead 1,000 years, and Selene did not let herself read them. She knew the shapes of that writing the way she knew her own hands. Her grandmother had taught it to her by candlelight, tracing the letters on the inside of her wrist where the marks would not show, and had told her they made words, and the words made one word above all others, hers by right, and her death by daylight. It was the speech of the Vael, who ruled before there were wolf kings, and who had been driven from the world so holy that their tongue was now a thing carved on tombs, and understood by no one. That was the shape of her safety. She walked the shrine with her eyes on the floor and did not read the walls she could read as easily as breathing. She had thought she was alone. "You light them in the wrong order," said a voice from the dark at the far end of the nave. Selene's heart stopped and started again. Past the last lamp, beyond a screen of carved stone tracery, a shape sat in shadow on a low bench, and she knew the shape, and she knew the voice, and she dropped at once to her knees with her eyes on the ground, because a servant did not look upon the king at his prayers, and because kneeling with her face down was the safest place her body had ever known. "Forgive me, your grace. I did not know you were here. No one is meant to know I am here. That is rather the point of a shrine kept dark." The old bench took his weight as he shifted. "You need not kneel. There is no court down here for you to fail in front of. Only stop looking at my floor as though it might forgive you something." She sat back on her heels, eyes still lowered, the stone screen between them so that he was only a darkness within the dark. It was, she would think later, the strangest place two people ever began to know one another. She among the leaning lamplight, he unseen behind the stone, both speaking to the air rather than to a face. "The old kings lie eldest to youngest along that wall," he said. "The lamps are woken the same way, eldest first. You began in the middle. No one living remembers why. I know it only because my father drilled it into me and his into him, back and back, until the reason is lost and only the order remains. Then I will wake the eldest first, your grace, though I could not tell you which of them is eldest." No, no one could. The names are cut above each lamp, but the writing is the old dead speech, and no soul in Vaskar has read it in 300 years. And there it was, laid at her feet like a snare with the jaws open. Selene kept her breath even, and said nothing, and was proud of her silence, right up until the Alpha King rose and crossed to the wall, and set his scarred hand beneath one carved line and read it aloud. He read it wrongly. He gave the old letters the sounds a stranger would guess at, and the true word bent and broke in his mouth into something that meant nothing, and Selene felt the mistake go through her like a splinter under a nail. Her grandmother's word. Her grandmother's careful hours, unmade. Before she knew her own lips had moved, they had shaped the word as it was meant to be shaped, soundless, only the ghost of it on her breath. But the shrine was very quiet, and the Alpha King had the ears of a wolf. He turned from the wall. She felt him turn. She kept her eyes on the floor, and her face still, and gave him nothing, the way she had given 600 laughing strangers. Nothing, and it was not enough, because he was not laughing, and he was not a stranger, and he had heard. "Say it again," he said quietly. "I said nothing, your grace. You know these words. It was not a question." He came back toward the screen and stopped on the far side of it, so close now that she could hear him breathe. "A servant out of Halvanmore, who lights the dead in the wrong order and reads the oldest tongue in the world, off my walls in the dark." His voice dropped lower still. "Come back tomorrow night." Selene knelt in the leaning lamplight with the whole weight of the mountain over her head, and understood that the one thing she could not afford in all the world had already begun. He had started to see her. And every night after this one, in the dark of the shrine, he would see a little more. She went back the next night, and the night after that, because a king's word was a king's word, and because some cold and long-starved part of her, a part she would not have confessed to any living soul, had begun to want to. The shrine became a country with only 2 people in it. By day, Selene was no one, a pair of hands at Ravella's heel, a gray shape the court had already forgotten, it had laughed at. But when the hold went dark, and Corlys had counted his servants to their cots, she carried her taper down under the mountain, woke the lamps from eldest to youngest, as she had been taught, and waited. After a while, the old bench at the far end would take a man's weight, and the Alpha King would speak to her out of the dark on the other side of the stone screen. They never once saw each other's faces. That was the whole shape of it. He was a darkness behind carved stone. She was a lowered head among the leaning flames. Perhaps that was why the talk came so easily between them. For it is a simpler thing to hand your true self to someone who cannot see your face, to weigh it. He tested her, as she had known he would. One night, he asked, idle as a man asking after the weather, whether the shapes on the walls meant anything to a girl out of Helvenmoor, or whether they were only shapes. Selene had built the answer long before he asked the question. Her grandmother, she said, had taught her that the old letters were charms against the dark, lucky marks a woman scratched on a threshold or a cradle, and that the meaning of them, if they had ever carried one, was long since lost. Only the shapes remained, she said, and she knew the shapes the way a child knows a song it can sing without understanding the words. It was a good lie because most of it was true, and she gave it to him, with her heart kept slow, and even, the way she had taught it to lie on the ride north. He was quiet a moment. She could not tell through the stone in the dark whether he had believed her. That not knowing became a third presence in the shrine, and it sat with her every night thereafter. But he gave her true things in return, and that she had not expected. He told her one night why a king kept vigil among his own dead. I sit with men I am ashamed to share blood with, he said. Vaskar was not built gently. There are things my grandfathers did to make this hold theirs that I would undo, if the undoing did not cost the living more than the dead. So I sit with them. Someone should have to look at what we are, and it may as well be the one who wears the crown. Selene knelt very still in the lamplight, and did not tell him that she knew, better than he did, exactly what his grandfathers had done, and to whom, and that the whom was kneeling 10 feet from him, lighting his lamps. He asked her another night what a girl of Helvenmoor missed most of the home she had left. She meant to give him something small and false. Instead, because the dark makes liars honest, she told him the truth. She missed being spoken to as a person, and not a task. She had been raised behind shutters, she said, kept out of sight for reasons she could not give him, and in all her life the only voices that had ever asked her a question and waited for the answer were her grandmother's, and now his. There was a long quiet after that. Then he said, very low, that he was sorry the list was so short, and that he would do what he could to lengthen it. She asked him once, carefully, about his queen. His answer was short and cold as a shut door. The marriage was a treaty with a woman's name written on it, he said, and nothing more, and he did not intend to make it more in a hurry. Selene told herself the small warmth that rose in her at that was relief for the peace, and not relief for herself, and she was too honest, even in her own head, to believe it for long. She was climbing back to the underwarren before dawn, when Ravella's voice caught her in the passage. They tell me, her cousin said, stepping from a doorway with a candle in her hand and no softness at all in her lovely face, that the king has taken to asking for a shrine girl by name. My shrine girl. My servant. She came close, and her whisper was a blade laid flat against the skin. So you will tell me, Sol, and you will tell me true. What does the Alpha King of Vaskar want? In the dark with the likes of you? Selene gave her cousin the smallest truth that would hold. The king kept vigil in the shrine, she said, and the shrine was her duty, and a servant did not choose whether a king spoke to her. Ravella studied her for a long moment, then smiled her lovely smile, and said that a wise servant would fall ill, and keep to her cot after dark, and let the shrine tend itself. It was not advice. Solène understood that. It was a wall going up, and she was on the wrong side of it. She might have obeyed. She had obeyed worse. But 2 nights later, sent up to the queen's apartments to fetch a forgotten shawl, she heard voices through the half-open door of the inner room and stopped with her hand on the cold stone, because one of the voices was the marshal's. She should have gone. Everything her mother taught her said to go. Instead, she stood in the dark of the passage and listened, and what she heard rearranged the whole world. They were not speaking as a marshal and a treaty bride should speak. There was an ease between them, an old practiced closeness, the low laughter of two people who had shared a great many secrets and at least one bed. And they were speaking of her, not of Saul, of the true daughter of Halvanmore, the one Valdres had chosen not to bring north in white. The little one plays her part, Ravella was saying. She lights her lamps and keeps her eyes down and thinks she is clever. Let her think it, said Valdres, and his pleasant voice had a patience in it that frightened Solène more than anger would have. She is worth more to me quiet and breathing than she has ever been worth in a grave, so long as no one learns what she carries in her blood. When the king has got an heir on you, and the peace is sealed in a cradle, she will simply be a servant who dies of a fever, as servants do. And the last of the old blood will go into the ground where it should have gone 100 years ago, and no one will ever rise for it again. Solène walked back down the stair without the shawl, with no memory of her feet touching the steps. Her cousin, who had held pins for her once, long ago, before the world sorted them, and the marshal knew. Not everything, or she would already be dead. But he knew there was old blood in the servant girl, and he meant to let the trap close slowly, and he had made her own cousin the jaws of it. That night in the shrine, she could not keep her heart slow, though she had spent her life trying. But the king missed nothing, that a frightened body gave away, and before she had knelt 3 breaths he said, from the dark behind the screen, "Something has frightened you. I can hear it in you. Your heart is running like a hunted thing, and you have not said one word. It is nothing, your grace. It is not nothing." A pause. And when he spoke again, his voice had lost its idleness. "I will not ask you to name it. I know something of secrets kept for the keeping of one's life. But do not tell me it is nothing. I am too old, and have been lied to by experts, and you are not yet one." He let that sit. "My marshal frightens better people than you. If it is him, you need only say the word him, and I will know enough." She said nothing. But she did not deny it, and in the dark he understood the not denying, and something in the quality of his silence changed, grew watchful and grim, and she realized he had suspected his own marshal long before a shrine girl came trembling into his dark. "Then hear me," Severin said quietly. "There are perhaps 4 people in this hold. I would not sell for a night's true sleep, and after these weeks, to my own great surprise, you are one of them. That is a dangerous thing for me to say, and a worse thing for you to carry, so carry it carefully." The bench creaked as he rose. "The elders meet at the next dark of the moon. Yorwin, the eldest, is blind and older than the walls, and has never once feared me. If Valdres moves, he will move then, and he will need the elders behind him, and I do not know that they are mine." They still spoke through stone, but the careful distance between king and servant had worn thin as a coin carried too long in a pocket. He made her laugh first. She would not have believed a man so grave could do it. But he had a dry way of describing his own court, the vain lords and scheming ladies, that caught her off guard and pulled a real laugh out of her before she could stop it, a sound she had not made since Halvanmore. On the far side of the screen, he went very still, the way a man goes still when he has seen a rare bird land close, and then he said, low, that he had begun to measure his days by how many hours remained, until the hold went dark. Solène pressed her hand flat to the cold stone between them, where his hand might have been on the other side, and did not say that she measured hers the same way. She did not need to. He could hear her heart, and her heart said it for her. Let us pause here a moment. You and I. If you are enjoying this story and you would like to hear how it ends, take a breath and tap the button to follow along so the next chapter finds its way to you. Now, back to the dark under the mountain. Because the dark was running out. The word came down through the hold like cold water finding cracks. The elders had spoken. The treaty was a wedding without a marriage. And a wedding without a marriage was no peace at all, only a pause between wars. The union must be sealed, and an heir begun, before the moon turned again, or Vasgar would take it as proof that Halvanmore had never meant the peace, and the border would open like a wound. Solon heard it in the kitchens, and in the passages, and finally from Nesta, who told her gently as one tells a child of a death, that the king would go to his queen within the week, because kings did not have the luxury of the hearts that servants broke in private. She went down to the shrine that night, knowing it might be one of the last, and found him already there, already standing, close against the screen. And for the first time in all their nights, neither of them spoke of dead kings or old letters. They stood on either side of the carved stone, with their hands pressed to the same cold place, palm to palm, through an inch of rock that neither would step around, though stepping around it was the easiest thing in the world, because the moment they saw each other truly, everything they were pretending would have to end. She did not sleep that night, nor the next. On the third day, the word ran through the hold, like a draft under a door, that the king would go to his queen at the week's turn, and Solène understood that whatever lived between a servant and a king in the dark had a last night now, and that the last night was nearly upon them. She went down to the shrine with her heart already broken, and something reckless standing in the place where her caution had stood her whole life. He was there. He was always there now. "Tomorrow you go to her," she said, before he could speak, before her courage could fail. "And after that, you will not come here, because a man who has sealed a peace does not sit in the dark with a servant. You know it. I know it." Her voice did not shake, and she was proud of that later, when she had little else to be proud of. "So I will ask you one thing tonight, and you may refuse me, and I will never ask again." "Ask," he said. "Only that." But she heard him rise on the far side of the stone. "Look at me." She laid her hand on the carved lip of the screen, where 3 short steps would carry her around it into the open where he stood. "No one has looked at my face in my whole life and known who they were truly looking at. I have been kept behind shutters, behind veils, behind this stone, since before I can remember. I am so tired of being a shape in the dark. Before you belong to her, I want one person in this world to have seen me and chosen to stay. Let it be you. Look at me, and I will stop pretending. And whatever comes after, at least it will have been true once." The silence stretched so long, she thought he had turned to stone himself. Then he said, very low, "No." The word dropped into her like a stone down a well, and she waited and waited for a splash that did not come. "You do not understand what you ask." His voice had gone rough now, not cold, though she was too wounded to hear the difference. "If I round that stone, if I see your face, and let you see mine, and call it true, then I have made you the thing kings make of pretty servants. A secret, a shame. A woman kept in a corner and set aside the day the crown requires it. I have done a great many things I cannot undo. I will not add you to them. A breath. Light your lamps for someone who can give you a whole life instead of a corner of one. That is the kindest thing I have left, and it is the last, so take it." She took it the way one takes a blow. She did not round the stone. She stepped back from it, and the 3 steps that would have carried her to him carried her away instead, and he let her go. And that letting go was the loudest thing she had ever heard. "He is only being kind," she told herself on the stair, her face wet and her hands in fists. "He does not want you. He is a king, and you are a servant, and for a little while, the dark let you both forget it. And now he has remembered, and so must you." She said it over and over, The way a woman worries a bruise to be sure it still hurts. Because the hurt was at least a thing she understood, and understanding was the only comfort left in it. She was wrong. She had heard the words, and missed the man beneath them, missed the thing that had cracked his voice on the word ruin. Because she had spent her whole life learning to expect rejection, and nothing in that life had taught her to know a man giving up the one thing he wanted in order to keep it safe. But she did not know that yet. She would not know it for a long time, and by the time she did, it would very nearly be too late. She lit no lamps the next night. She lay on her cot in the dark and listened to the hold breathing above her, and knew that somewhere in it the king was walking to his queen, and she pressed her hands over her ears like a child. This was the state she was in, hollowed out and careless of herself, when the summons came that would put a cup of poison into her hands. The feast was held the night before the elders were to gather, and it was meant to be a celebration, though Selene could not have said of what. The great hall blazed with more torches than she had ever seen lit at once, and the long tables ran with wine, and at the high seat sat Ravella in cloth of silver, with the queen's circlet in her dark hair, and beside her sat the Alpha King, stone-faced, a man attending his own burial. Selene carried wine, because she was told to carry wine. She kept her eyes down and moved along the tables and did not look at the high seat, because to look at him now was to feel again the 3 steps she had not taken, and she had no more weeping left in her to spend. All evening she felt the wrongness of the room without understanding it. The 2 bright torches, the marshal, too pleased, the queen, too still, the way the air feels before a mountain lets go its snow. She did not see the marshal watching her. She had stopped watching for him, which was the first rule Nesta had ever given her, and the breaking of it nearly cost her everything. When the toasts began, Valdris rose. He spoke of peace, and of blood mingled, and of the long war ended, and the hall pounded the tables, and then his pleasant voice turned, light as a man reaching for a sweet, toward the servants along the wall. "There is one among us," he said, "who tends our dead kings in the dark, alone, without complaint, a humble office. It is only fitting that the humble should drink to the peace their betters have made." He beckoned, and a page brought a cup, and the marshal held it out across the space between the high table and the wall, and every face in the hall turned to see which servant the marshal meant. He meant Selene. Of course he meant Selene. She understood, as she walked forward with all those eyes upon her, that she could not refuse. To refuse a marshal's courtesy before the whole court was a thing a servant did not survive. She took the cup. It was warm from someone's hand, and the wine in it smelled of wine and of something underneath the wine, something green and wrong that she had no name for but that her whole body flinched from, and she thought, with a strange calm, so this is how it is to be. Not a fever after all, a cup and a smile, and a room full of witnesses, to swear the servant drank of her own accord. She lifted the cup. There was nothing else to do. Her grandmother's voice came from very far away. "Keep your face still," and she kept it still, and she raised the poison toward her mouth, and across the whole length of the hall a man who had told her 3 nights ago to light her lamps for someone worthier came up out of the king's own seat, as though the seat had thrown him. She never drank it. A chair went over at the high table with a crash that stopped every voice in the room. The Alpha King had crossed the distance faster than a crippled grief had any right to move, faster than a man that size should move, and his hand closed over hers on the cup, and for one instant she felt the warmth of him against her skin. The first and only time he had ever touched her in the light. Then he tore the cup away and flung it, and it struck the flags and burst, and the wine ran dark across the stone, and the whole hall saw the King of Vasker standing between his marshal and a serving girl with fury plain on his face. "Whose cup?" Severin said into the silence. "Was that?" No one answered, and then his eyes changed. He looked down at his own hand, at the fingers wet where the wine had splashed him when he seized it, and Selene saw the understanding cross his face a half-breath before his body knew it. He had not simply knocked the cup away. He had caught it. The wrongness that had been meant for her was on his skin now, and a wolf's skin drinks what touches it faster than any mouth could. "Severin," she said. She had never once used his name. His knee buckled. He caught the edge of the table, and the table was not enough, and he went down hard onto the wet stone, and the hall came apart into screaming. Solon was on the floor beside him before she knew she had moved, her hands on his face, and his eyes were open and fixed on nothing, and his breath came fast and shallow and wrong. "A healer!" she was shouting, she who never raised her voice. "A healer! He is poisoned. Someone, please." Hands pulled at her, dragged her back, for a servant did not touch the king. But he had touched her first, in front of all of them. And she fought them until an old woman with a healer's satchel shoved through the crowd and knelt and put her ear to his chest and her nose to his wet hand and went gray. "This is meant to kill the wolf in him," the healer said. "I have seen it once. It does not always kill the man." She looked up, and of all the faces in that hall, her eyes found Selena's, as if she knew. "Pray, it takes only the wolf. If it takes more than the wolf, it will take his legs and then his breath, and then him." Somewhere behind her, Solene heard the marshal already at work, grave and swift and full of sorrow, calling for the guard, calling for the healers, calling for calm, arranging himself at the very center of the disaster he had made as though he were the one steady thing holding the hall together. Even then, on her knees in the spilled wine, she understood what she was hearing. A man does not grieve so smoothly for a thing he did not plan. They lifted him, to carry him from his own feast like a fallen tree. As they raised him, his head rolled, and his eyes found her, in the crush of legs and torchlight, and though he was already going under, already past sense, his hand came up and closed hard on her wrist, and he dragged one word up out of the dark that was taking him. "Hide," he said. "The cup was yours. Hide." And then his hand fell open, and they bore him away, and Selena knelt alone on the wet stone, in the wreck of the cup that had been meant for her, and understood two things with a terrible clarity. The poison had been hers, and the man dying under it had known in the half-breath before he reached her exactly what catching that cup would cost him, and had spent his last waking word not on his own life, but on hers. They did not let her near him for 2 days. She was a servant, and servants were sent back to their work, and her work was to stand at the heel of the woman who had almost certainly carried the poison from the marshal's hand to the pages. Selene stood there and folded gowns and set out pearls, and said nothing, because saying anything would have ended her, and a dead servant could do nothing for the man dying 2 floors above. She thought she would go mad from the standing and the folding and the not knowing, from the queen's little satisfied silences and the marshal's grave passing kindnesses that were worse than any open cruelty. She did not. She had been trained her whole life to hold still, while her heart tore itself apart behind a still face, and she had never been more grateful for that cruel schooling than in those 2 days. On the 3rd day the fever broke, and the hold learned what the poison had left behind. The Alpha King would live. But the wolf in him was gone, burned out and silent, and no one in Bhaskar knew whether it would ever wake again. And the healer had been right about the rest. Whatever had killed the wolf had not stopped at the wolf. Severin could not stand. His legs would bear no weight at all. He had been a soldier before ever he was a wolf, and a wolf before ever he was a king, and he woke from the fever a man who could not so much as cross his own room. And Selene, hearing it whispered in the passages, had to set her back against the cold wall and breathe until the floor stopped tilting under her. An alpha who cannot shift cannot hold a hold. Every soul in Vaskar knew the old law of it, and none knew it better than Valdris, who moved through those days with a grave and sorrowful face and a voice full of tender concern. He grieved so beautifully. He let it be known, gently, reasonably, that a wounded king should not be troubled with the burdens of rule while he healed, and that a steady hand should hold things in trust in the meantime, his hand. only until the king was well, only for the sake of the peace. And the court, which loved a strong man and feared a weak one, began to drift toward the marshal the way iron filings drift toward a stone that has been rubbed the right way. The gathering that should have sat the morning after the feast never sat at all. There was no king well enough to bring before it, and Valdres was in no hurry to convene the elders now, not while a slower and surer road to the same throne lay open before him. When at last they let her in to him, she was not prepared for how small the greatest man she had ever known could be made to look in a wide bed. She had come with fresh linen, because linen gave her a reason to be there. He was awake. His eyes tracked her across the room, and something in them eased when he saw who it was. And that easing undid her more than the tears would have. She sat, and she took his hand to change the cloth beneath it, and the moment her skin met his, the thing that had only whispered through the stone screen came through her in a flood. His pain, sharp and low and constant. His fury, banked and useless. And beneath both, a shame, so wide she nearly gasped, the shame of a man who had been the strength of a whole people and could not now lift a cup. It poured into her, and then when she took her hand away to wring the cloth, it stopped, clean as a shut door. She said nothing of it. She only knew, now, that her blood had learned to read him the way it read the walls of the shrine, and that, whatever he said, with his hard, flat voice, she would never again be entirely fooled by it, because she could feel the truth of him running underneath. It was Nesta who told her the rest. That night, in the dark of the under-warren, her old face, frightened. "He has asked for you," the old woman whispered. In his fever, he asked for the shrine girl, and asked again waking. And the marshal did not like it, and so the marshal has decided to be generous. They are sending the king away to heal, to an old steading up the mountain, out of the elder's sight, out of the way. A broken king in a far house troubles no one. And the king has asked that the girl who tends his dead be sent to tend him, and the marshal has said, yes. Her grip tightened to the bone. He says yes, because a servant up a mountain is a servant, easily lost child. He is not sending you to nurse a king. He is sending you both somewhere quiet, to die when it suits him. She understood better than Nesta could, for Nesta did not know what ran in her blood, or why the marshal wanted that blood in the ground. Then I will go, she said, child. He caught the cup that was meant for me, Selene said, and her voice went steady in the way it went steady only when something in her had stopped being afraid. He knew what it would take from him, and he caught it anyway, and his last word before the dark took him was a warning to keep me safe. You tell me the marshal means to bury us both up that mountain. I tell you I would climb it on my knees for the chance to be the one who is beside him. Let the marshal think he is digging our grave. Let him think it, and let him grow careless, thinking it. They left within the week, up a road that climbed into cloud, and Selene rode in the servant's cart and did not once see the king, who traveled ahead in a closed litter, and she watched the mountains fold shut behind them like a door swinging to. She was not afraid. Fear had been her whole life, and she had set it down at the feast, on the whetstone, beside a fallen king, and the thing she had picked up in its place had no name in any tongue she was permitted to speak. But the old tongue had a word for it. The old tongue had a word for everything that mattered, and one word above all the rest. And it was riding up the mountain with her, folded on the inside of her wrist, waiting. The steading sat in a high fold of the mountain, where the air was thin and clean, and the nights came down cold and enormous with stars. It had been a hunting lodge of the old kings, once timber and gray stone, half swallowed now by moss and the wild, and it held nothing but a handful of frightened servants, a locked room of dust, and a king who would not look at anyone. For the first days, Severin would not look at her either. He sat where they placed him, by the window or by the fire, and stared out at the mountains. He could no longer run, and answered when spoken to and otherwise did not speak. And Selene, who had spent her whole life learning to be invisible, Knew a man trying to make himself invisible to his own life when she saw one. She did not push. She lit his fire and carried his meals and learned the exact weight of him when he had to be lifted, one arm behind his back and one beneath his ruined legs. And every time she touched him the flood came, his shame and his grief and his fury. And every time she let go it stopped, and slowly, without either of them naming it, the touching became a language of its own. On the sixth morning, she did the thing she had been turning over since the road. In the locked room of dust, she had found an old saddle and the rig of a hunting sling, the kind the ancient kings had used to bring a wounded man down off a mountain without breaking him. She spent 3 days mending the cracked leather with a servant's needle and a stubbornness that had frightened better women than the ones at the steading, and on the sixth morning, she and the 2 strongest servants got the king up onto the back of the steadiest horse in the little stable, strapped safe and upright in a cradle of old leather. His dead legs held, his hands free upon the reins. "What is this?" he said. It was the first thing he had asked her unprompted since the feast. "It is a way out of that chair," Solani said. "You were a wolf who ran this whole mountain. You are not a wolf now, and I am sorrier for that than I have words for. But you are still a man who can sit a horse if the horse is patient and the leather holds. And I would rather you cursed at me from the top of that ridge than went quiet in a chair for the rest of your days. So curse at me if you like. But ride." He looked at her a long moment. She kept her eyes down out of habit, out of protocol, out of the old safety, and he said, quietly, "Look at me." They were her own words, the ones she had spent on him on the last night in the shrine, when she had begged him to look at her and he had refused her. Now he handed them back, and this time it was he who asked, and she who found she could not refuse. Now he asked, and she was too tired and too full of him to refuse, and she lifted her eyes to the Alpha King of Vascaray in the thin gold morning, and he looked at her, truly looked, the way no one in her whole life had been permitted to, and whatever he saw did not make him turn away. "There you are," he said, as though he had been looking for her a long while. "I have talked to you through a wall for half a season, and never once seen your face. I thought it would be a plain face. It is not a plain face. It is only a servant's face, your grace." "It is not," he said, "and we both know that it is not. And one day soon, you are going to tell me the truth of what you are, and I am going to do you the courtesy of pretending to be surprised. But not today. Today you are going to lead this horse to the top of that ridge, because I find that I want very much to see the top of that ridge. And, until about a quarter of an hour ago, I did not want to see anything ever again." She led the horse to the top of the ridge. Tu vois? He wept a little there, at the whole world laid out blue and endless below him, and blamed the wind, and she pretended to believe him, and it was without any question the finest morning of her life. They had many such mornings after. They rode out under the huge sky, and on the days the weather held, they would stop in some high meadow, and she would spread a blanket and help him down onto it against a stone warm from the sun, and he told her things he had told no one, how he had been the second son who never wanted the crown and had spent 30 years being glad the burden lay elsewhere. How the burden had come to him anyway in a single afternoon, and he had never once felt equal to it. And she gave him true things back, carefully, the safe ones. A childhood of shuttered rooms, a grandmother's candlelit lessons, a loneliness so complete she had believed it was simply the shape of the world, until the dark of a shrine taught her otherwise. Their hands would find each other on the blanket, and the bond would open, and she would feel, under all his gentleness, the low, unkillable certainty that he was a ruin she deserved to be spared, and it broke her heart a little more each time, because she did not yet know how to argue with a feeling. One evening the wind kept them indoors, and she sat close by his chair to read to him by the one good candle, and somewhere in the reading his hand came up and touched her hair, only that, only once, the way a man touches a thing he has decided he is not allowed to keep. She went still. The bond opened, and through it she felt how much that small touch had cost him, and how fiercely he wanted to be a whole man again, for the length of one honest hour, long enough to turn her face up to his, and do the thing they had both spent weeks not doing. He drew his hand back. He always drew his hand back. She told herself she did not mind, and read on in a voice that shook only a little, and the candle burned low between them, and neither of them said the thing, and by then the not saying of it had become its own kind of tenderness. That was how the letter found them, 3 weeks on, carried up the mountain in the marshal's own hand, by a rider who would not meet the king's eyes. So Len read it aloud, because the king's hands had begun to shake in a way he tried to hide, and she got 4 lines into it before her own voice failed her. The Queen of Vasgar, the letter said, was with child. The peace was sealed in a cradle at last. The kingdom rejoiced, and Severin sat very still in his chair by the window and said, in a voice gone flat and terrible, "That child is not mine. I have never once touched her. That child is not mine, and I know exactly whose it is." Solene set the letter down with hands gone cold to the wrist. "Then it is all true," she said. "Everything I heard through the door. It was never only about the treaty." "Tell me what you heard." His eyes had come up, sharp now, the king, awake in them for the first time since the feast. "All of it. No more careful half things. If we are to die on this mountain, soul, then I will at least die, knowing what we are dying for," so she told him. Not all of it, not yet the thing that ran in her blood, but the rest, the marshal and the queen, speaking as long-practiced lovers, the old blood the marshal meant to put in the ground, the servant who would quietly die of a fever once the peace was sealed in a cradle. Severin listened without once looking away, and when she had finished he was quiet a long while, and when he spoke, his voice was that of a man reading his own sentence off a wall. "Then it is finished, and finished cleverly. Valdres has his heir, his own get dressed in my name, and a treaty no lord in either kingdom will break for the sake of a swaddled child. He has a queen who does as she is told, and a king who cannot stand up to stop him. The elders will not follow a wolf with no wolf left in him. They will bless the cradle and forget the man, and once they have forgotten me, no one in all the world will so much as ask where the shrine girl went." He turned his ruined, unbowed face to her. "He has thought of everything. He has thought of everything except one thing. And that one thing is the only move I have left on the board. And I am going to make it now, and you are going to hate me for it. Severin, you are going to leave this mountain tonight." He said it fast before she could stop him, the way a man tears a blade from a wound to have the worst of it over. "Nesta has a cousin among the pack traders. There is a way down the far side of the ridge, and coin enough, and a name to travel under that no one is hunting. And by the time Valdres sends his men, there will be one broken king alone in this house and no girl at all. And he will not spend a single rider chasing a servant into the wide world when he has a whole kingdom already in his fist. You will go down that mountain. You will live. You will be free of every part of this, of shutters and veils and stone screens and dying kings, and you will find some quiet green country where no one has ever heard the word Vasgar, and you will be no one's secret and no one's servant ever again, and in time you will forget you ever knelt in the dark and lit a lamp for a fool who did not deserve it. I have spent my whole life sending men to their deaths for the good of the hold, and telling myself the arithmetic was clean. Let me, just once, spend the arithmetic the other way. Let me lose the one thing I want, and keep it breathing somewhere in the wide world where I do not have to watch it die. Grant me that much. It is the only prayer I have left." "No," Selene said. "I am not asking you. I am your king. It is the last order I will ever have the right to give, and I am giving it. You caught the cup." She crossed the room and knelt at his chair, so that for once he had to look down at her and not she up at him, and she took his shaking hands in both of hers and held them still. "You caught the cup that was meant for me, and it cost you your wolf and your legs and your crown, and now you would spend the very last thing you have left in the world which is me, to buy me a life in some green country where you will never once be. And you call that saving me? I call it robbery. You do not get to give me away in order to keep me safe, Severin. That was never yours to give. It was never anyone's to give but mine. You do not get to be noble at my expense and call it love, Severin. Love that spends me without asking is only one more man deciding what becomes of me, and I have had a lifetime's belly full of men deciding what becomes of me. I have already spent the one thing that was mine to spend. I spent it on you, and a thing like that cannot be unspent. And because she was holding his hands, she felt it all break open in him, the way it had only begun to break open when they touched through the long nights of care, but wider now, a flood with no wall left, anywhere to hold it. She felt his love for her, vast and hopeless, and asking nothing in return. She felt his iron certainty that he was wreckage, and that she deserved to be kept well clear of him. And she felt, beneath all of it, the truth he would have died before saying aloud, that in his whole hard soldier's life, she was the single good thing that had ever simply looked at him and chosen, of its own free will, to stay. You feel that, he said, staring at her, his voice gone unsteady. You have felt it, for weeks, when we touch. What are you, Saul? What are you truly, that you can reach into a man and hold his own heart in your two hands? Someone who is not leaving. She lifted his hands and pressed them to her face, and held them there. Ask me the other question tomorrow, the one you meant to ask on the ridge. Tonight only believe me, because I have never in my life meant anything more. I am not going down that mountain. I am not leaving you to them. Whatever comes for us, it will have to come for us both. For a moment he could not answer her at all. She watched the war go on behind his eyes, the soldier who had spent his whole life spending himself to keep other people safe, running headlong into a woman who refused, flatly, to be kept safe at his cost. She felt, through their joined hands the instant the war ended, felt something in him lay down its weapons at last, not because he had stopped being afraid for her, but because he had finally understood that her staying had never once been his to forbid. He bowed his head against their clasped hands and breathed. Once, unsteadily, like a man who has held his breath for 30 years and has only now been given leave to let it out. He might have argued. She would never know, because that was the moment the horn sounded far down the mountain road, low and long, the horn of a company riding hard, and one of the frightened servants came running, white-faced, to say there were riders on the road, under the marshal's grey, and that they carried a summons in the king's own name, calling the Alpha King and all his household down to the hold to stand before the gathered elders at the dark of the moon, 3 days hence. They went down the mountain because there was no not going. The riders were courteous and armed, and never more than a length from the litter, and Solon rode again in the servant's cart, with her hands folded and her face still, and did the only useful thing left to do, which was to think. She had 3 days. She spent them, the way her grandmother had taught her to spend the worst hours of a life, in silence, turning over and over the one thing she owned that the marshal did not know she owned, not a blade, not an army, a word, her grandmother had made her swear, on the old woman's own failing breath, never to speak it. It is your death, by daylight, she had said, tracing the shape of it on the soft inside of a child's wrist, again and again, until the child could have drawn it in her sleep. But she had said something else too. At the very end, something the child had not understood, and the woman in the swaying cart understood at last. It is your death, the old woman had whispered, unless the hour comes when it is your throne. And you will know that hour. You will have one breath in which to know it, and no more. Do not waste the breath, my heart. We have all of us waited too long in the dark for you to waste the breath. On the last night, in the hold, they let her see him. She never learned why. Perhaps Valdres wanted them soft and grieving, and hopeless for the morning. A broken king, and his weeping servant made a tidier picture than two people with nothing left to lose. She did not care why. They put her into the small, cold room where the king was kept under guard, and shut the door, and for a little while there was no marshal, and no elders, and no morning coming, only the two of them, and one candle, and the truth she had carried her whole life sitting ready at last on her tongue. "Tomorrow they will set me aside," Severin said. "Name the child my heir, name Valdris regent, and be done with me. And they will do it in the deep hall, among my own dead, because in Vaskar, the old and terrible things are always decided among the dead." His jaw worked. "And you will be in that hall, in the servants' row close enough that when it is done and they come for you, I will have to watch, and be able to do nothing. And that Saul, not the crown, not the wolf, not the legs, that is the thing I cannot bear. So, I am going to beg them. I am going to spend every friend and every favor I have left in the world to buy your life, and it will not be enough, and I am going to do it anyway, because—" "Be quiet," Selena said gently, "and listen to me, because I am only going to be able to say this once, and I have been forbidden to say it since before I could walk." She knelt by his chair and took his hands, so that the bond opened wide between them and he would feel that every single word was true. "My name is not Saul. My grandmother was the last daughter of a house that ruled these mountains before there was ever a Vaskar to rule them, before there were wolf kings at all, before your grandfathers drove my people out of the daylight and taught the whole world to call us a nursery story. I am the last of the Vale. I am the blood your ancestors are ashamed to lie down beside in that shrine. And I carry the one thing they could not silence when they silenced the rest, because they never dreamed a child had carried it out of the fire, hidden on her skin where no one thought to look. I carry the word." Through their joined hands, she felt him believe it, felt the vast, slow rearrangement of it move through him, and then, absurdly, impossibly, she felt him begin to laugh, low and shaking, the first true laugh she had heard from him since the high meadow. It was not a laugh at her. It was the laugh of a man handed, at the very bottom of the worst night of his life, a weapon he had not known existed, who recognizes it at once, and who begins helplessly against all his own good sense. He gripped her hands until it hurt. He looked at her as though seeing her for a third time, the servant, then the woman, and now this, the last living heir of the very people his own blood had tried to wipe from the daylight, kneeling in a cold cell at his side, choosing him, arming him, when by every right she owned she should have left his whole cursed line to rot. "Every elder in that hall," he said, "is sworn to a law older than my crown, older than the treaty, older than the war, older than Valdris and his cradle, and every scheme he ever hatched. Older than everything," Selene agreed. "When the true blood speaks, the old blood rises. They cannot choose otherwise. It is not a courtesy they pay, it is in them, in the marrow, the way the wolf was in you. Valdris knows there is old blood in a servant. He does not know she can speak it. He believes the word died in a shuttered room with an old woman years ago and miles away. Tomorrow he is going to stand up in front of every elder in Vaskar and try to bury a living king. And I am going to stand up out of the servants' row, and I am going to say one word, and then we are all of us going to find out whether he was right." "And if you are wrong," Severin said, very quietly, "they will not let you leave that hall alive, and I will not be able to reach you." "Then do not be far from me," she said, "so that whichever way it falls, the last thing I see is your face, and not theirs." The elders gathered at the dark of the moon in the deep hall under the mountain, in the shrine of the dead kings itself, and Selene stood among the servants at the back in her borrowed grey, with her hands folded and her eyes on the floor, in exactly the place the world had always kept her. Yorwin sat at the head of the elders, blind, and so old that no one living remembered a time without him. The elders sat in their long ranks below him. The court stood behind the elders, and the servants stood behind the court. And at the front, on a litter, they had set the Alpha King, brought in to be put aside among his fathers. Valdris spoke beautifully. He had always spoken beautifully. He grieved so tenderly for his stricken king. He praised the coming child. He spoke of steady hands and hard necessities, and he asked the elders, so gently that it hardly sounded like the taking of a kingdom at all, to name a regent to guard the peace until happier days. And the elders murmured among themselves, and then, one by one, the old grey heads began to incline toward the marshal. And Selene watched the whole vast weight of the hall begin to tilt toward Valdris the way water tilts toward the lowest place, slow and certain and impossible to argue with. She looked at the litter. Severin had lifted his head, and across the whole crowded hall he had found her, and he held her eyes, and his face said the thing it had said, on the ridge, in the gold morning. There you are. Solon stepped out of the servants' row. A servant did not step forward in the hall of the elders. A servant did not step forward anywhere. Heads turned. A ripple of affront went through the court at the sheer wrongness of it. A grey girl walking up the open floor, as though she had any right to the air, the great ones breathed. Valdris turned, and his pleasant face went still, and she watched him place her, watched him truly see, for the first time, the shrine girl he had meant to lose quietly up a mountain, and she saw the first honest fear she had ever put into a living soul cross the marshal's eyes. Selene raised her head. All the way, for the first time in her whole life, she lifted her face in front of more than a single pair of eyes, and let a room full of her betters look at it. And into the ringing silence of the deep hall, she spoke the word her grandmother had traced into her 10,000 times before she could walk. The word that was her death by daylight and her throne by right. The first word of the old tongue spoken aloud in Vascaray in 300 years. She spoke it clearly, in her own low voice. The voice she had kept down her whole life to stay alive. She spoke Wisan. For one heartbeat nothing happened at all, and the heartbeat lasted 1,000 years, and in it she thought, calmly, so I was wrong. And at least his was the last face. Then old Yorwin, blind Yorwin, who had not risen from his seat for a king in 40 years, who could not by any ordinary means have known who stood on that floor or what she was, put his 2 spotted hands upon the arms of his great chair, and pushed, and rose trembling to his feet. And beside him an elder rose, and beside her another. Down the whole ancient rank of them, they came up out of their seats like a hillside of grass, standing all at once into a wind that no one else could feel. The old blood in them answering the word whether they willed it or not, past thought, past fear, past the marshal and his cradle and his careful grief, until every elder in the deep hall of Vasker stood, risen for a servant in grey. It made no sound, the rising, and that was the wonder of it, and the terror of it both. There was no cheer, no cried command, no order given or obeyed. There was only the long, dry whisper of robes, as rank upon rank of the oldest and proudest creatures in the kingdom came to their feet against their own wills, drawn upright by a single word out of a serving girl's mouth, the way the tide is drawn up by a moon it has never seen and cannot refuse. And the marshal stood alone in the midst of them, the one man in all that room, still straining to bow the world toward himself, and finding, at the very last, that the world would not bend. And from the litter, where they had carried him in to be set aside among his dead, Severin of Vaskar felt the wolf that had been burned out of him 3 weeks and a lifetime ago stir at the sound of that word, like a banked ember finding air, and lift its head in the dark of him, and open its eyes. Afterward, Selene would remember the deep hall in pieces, the way one remembers a house that has burned. She would remember blind Yorwin, turning his ruined face toward the sound of her voice with tears standing in his dead eyes, and the old man, speaking into the astonished silence, in the cracked and careful shapes of the old tongue that no living mouth in Vaskar had shaped aloud in 3 centuries. He had been a boy, he said, a small boy hidden under a floor, on the night the last of the Vale were driven out of the daylight, and he had heard things through that floor he had carried for 90 years, and he had prayed every night since, without any hope at all, only out of habit and old shame. To be allowed to live long enough to stand up once more for the true blood, before he died. And now he had stood. And now, he said, his voice breaking on the ancient words, he could go into the dark content, having stood. No one moved to hush him. No one in that hall would ever again move to hush the old tongue, or the old blood, or the small gray people the mountains had spent 300 years trying to forget. That, too, had changed, in the space of a single spoken word. She would remember Valdris trying to speak, and finding that not one soul in the hall would turn to look at him. For the failure to be looked at is the beginning of the end of every man who has traded all he had for the looking. She would remember the child's true father, written plain across the queen's white face, the moment the elders turned their risen attention upon her, and Ravella, reaching from long habit for the lovely, easy lie that had carried her through her whole gilded life, and discovering, for the first time, that her beautiful face bought her precisely nothing in a room that had just watched a servant make the elders rise. The marshal and the false queen were taken from that hall under guard, to answer for a cup of poison and a false air, and a peace built upon poison and lies. And Selena found she felt no triumph in it, and no grief, either, only the wide, clean quiet of a thing at last set back into its right and rightful place. And she would remember, above all the rest of it, the moment the litter moved. They had carried the king into that hall to set him aside. He rose from it under his own strength, not all at once, and not without a cost that showed in his face, and with one hand locked hard on the arm-blind Yorwin held out to him. But the wolf had come back into him, and the wolf, over the slow, patient days and weeks that followed, would knit back much of what the poison had unmade. And on that first night he got his own feet beneath him in the hall of his fathers and stood swaying, upright, and crossed the open floor to her one uncertain step at a time, while the whole risen court stood watching and stopped in front of the gray servant. Every last one of them had spent a season looking clean through, as though she were a pane of glass. "There is a question," Severin said, "that I told you I would ask you tomorrow. On the ridge, in the sun, before a letter came and I lost my nerve and tried to send you away instead. I have discovered that I am out of tomorrows to hide behind. It is today, it is now, it is here, in the light, in front of every soul who ever looked past you." He took her two hands in his, there in the full glare of the torches, where the kings of Vasgar did not hold the hands of serving girls. "I can offer you a poor sort of bargain, a crown that half this court must be taught to trust again. A wolf that will always limp a little now, a man who cannot promise you a single, easy year. But you were the true daughter of Halvanmore long before you were ever revealed as the last of the Vael, which means, Saul, that you were the bride the treaty promised me from the start, before a marshal hid you behind a decoy and a dead woman's gray cloak. You were mine to be given and I was yours, and I very nearly lost you forever for the crime of not knowing it, so I am asking you now, out loud, with my eyes open and the whole world watching, and no stone screen left anywhere between us. Stay, not in a corner, not as anyone's secret, at my side, in the open, where every soul who ever looked straight through you will have to look at you, and rise for you every day for the rest of their lives." Selene, who had been taught from the hour of her birth to keep her face still and her voice low and her eyes upon the floor, lifted her eyes to his, and let her still face show every last thing it had spent a lifetime hiding, and answered him without keeping her voice low at all, so that the whole risen hall would hear it. "My whole life I was told that to stay alive I had to be no one," she said. "You are the first person who ever met me in the dark and cared to learn who I was. Of course, I will stay. I was only ever waiting to be asked as myself." They were married, in the spring, in the deep hall among the old dead, with the elders risen to their feet, and the whole court standing behind them, and blind Yorwin speaking the blessing in the old tongue over a vale and a wolf king. The first such joining since before the long war that had made the mountains bleed. And on the day she walked that hall, there was no veil across her face, and no borrowed grey upon her back, and no cousin in silver walking 3 steps ahead of her for the world to admire instead. Selene walked in alone at her own unhurried pace in the light, and the same court that had laughed at her once, at a grey servant in a dead woman's cloak, rose to its feet as she passed, rank upon rank, the way a field stands into the wind, and did not laugh, and could not look away, and could not, any one of them, ever again, pretend they had not seen her. She had been born to be no one. She had been kept low and hidden, and taught from the cradle that her only safety in all the world lay in her silence. And in the end it was one word, spoken a single time, in the light, in her own low, unhurried voice, that had lifted a whole kingdom to its feet. Long after the feasting, when the hall had emptied, Selene went down alone to the shrine of the dead kings, as she had gone down nearly every night of that strange season, and lit the lamps from eldest to youngest, as she had been taught. She did not need the taper now. She had stopped needing it. Each cold lamp took light as she came to it, leaning toward her through the still air, the way the very first of them had leaned toward her, on the night she arrived, friendless and frightened, and no one at all. She understood it now. The dead had known her, before the living ever did. They had only been waiting, the way blind Yorwin had waited, the way the whole buried old blood of the mountain had waited, for one of their own, to walk back into the light and speak. Behind her the door opened, and she did not turn, for she knew his uneven step by now, the way she knew her own heart, and the Wolf King of Asgard came and stood beside his queen among his shamed and sleeping fathers, and for once in that ancient place there was no stone between them, and no dark, and nothing at all left to hide. Thank you for listening, and for staying with the two of them all the way to the end. Before you go, I would love to know one thing. Do you believe Severin was right to try to send her down the mountain to save her, giving up the only thing in the world he wanted, or was that a choice that belonged to her alone to make? Tell me what you think in the comments below, and I will see you very soon for another story.